Merri and the Fairies. Written, illustrated, and read to you by Megan Elizabeth Reginold. Dedicated to squirrels everywhere, but mostly Pablo, the best balcony squirrel an apartment dweller could ever hope for. Special thanks to my wonderful first reader, Lillian Ramon, for checking out the first chapters and letting me know it was worth finishing. Chapter 1. Whispers in the Tree. The sun rose slowly over the building tops in a splash of color. The first rays of daylight tickled the tree branches of Mortartown's last real forested area, a tiny park in the middle of town. Sunshine glinted through the leaves and onto the shiny yellow bodies of tractors, neatly lined up in a roped-off area of the parking lot. "We'll never find the right one to help us. I don't know why we're even still trying," grumbled a voice from behind some of the thick green leaves of a large and auspicious-looking oak tree. A much warmer voice chided back. "I don't know why you have to be so negative, Thistle. I'm pretty sure we're on the right track. You've heard them call her by the name. It's the same name as the prophecy. Besides, what good does grumbling do?" Thistle's voice sounded sullen as he grumbled back. "What good does being hopeful do? What good did it do for Thorn or Blackberry or Sap? None. No good. So I don't see how grumbling is any worse, thank you very much, Dew." "Oh, foo on you and your attitude. Things are going to work out soon. I can feel it in the air. This is a good sunrise. I can smell it." Leaves rustled as Dew repositioned herself in the tree with the soft sound of wings flitting. The first groans of the tractors starting up cut through the quiet morning. "Just you wait, Thistle. Everything is going to work out. We're going to get help, and things will be right as rain before you know it." There was a terrible crack and a large thump, then a smash, and the tractors beeped as they uprooted an old birch tree. As the roots broke from the ground, Dew chirped out a startled sound before a loud popping noise stopped her. A small cloud of glittering dust drifted through the branches of the oak tree, and Dew was silent. "I hope so, Dew. I hope so very much." Thistle flitted his wings and sniffled as the glitter wafted away on a breeze. "I miss you already." His quiet sniffles were drowned out by the loud beeps of a dump truck backing in to collect the birch tree's debris from the excavator that was already mashing it to bits. Chapter 2. Merri is embarrassed. Merriweather Annabelle Peasant, or Merri for short, was the most forgettable sort of girl. She had mousy-colored hair that was neither curly nor straight, and was so petite for her age that she was either mistaken for being much younger or mistaken for not being there at all. During classes, teachers would often forget to send an extra test paper down her row, or forget to mark her on the roll sheet. Oftentimes, Merriweather's parents would even speak about her across the dinner table as though she weren't there, and both Mr. and Mrs. Peasant would blink at her in surprise if she chimed into the conversation. This morning, Merri was peering out her window at a particularly spectacular-looking blue jay that was preening itself on the branch just outside her bedroom window on the second floor of her house. Absolutely gorgeous adult jay, just out of adolescence, denoted by the leftover down feathers stuck to various parts of the bird. She narrated out loud as she made notes in her bird journal. Her overweight orange tabby, Carlton, meowed a response in a courteous but uncommitted sort of way. He was washing his face amidst the dozens of bird sketches, bird notes, and bird-related pamphlets spread across Merri's bed. The bird in question ruffled himself, and bits of down feathers flopped off his puffed-out chest and danced silently on the breeze. A bit of down got caught in the screen of Merri's window, and she dutifully sketched the feather for her own references. Merri's non-spectacular talent of being easily unseen had turned out to be a lucky break for her favorite hobby of birdwatching. Usually, if you approached a bird, it would be flighty enough to take wing as soon as it caught sight or scent of you. Fortunately for Merri, even the birds took little notice of her, and she was able to approach pigeons directly, even so far as prodding them with her pencil to get a better look at their wing patterns as they fed on crumbs at the park. Carlton stretched languidly and strolled over to look at Merri's sketching. Merri was terribly focused as she catalogued the feather into her journal. She completely lost track of the time, which would have been better used to get ready for school. Carlton plopped himself casually across her journal, knocking the pencil out of her hand and kicking bird-related papers off the windowsill. Merriweather squawked in surprise and indignation and grumbled as she bent to pick up her things. Honestly, Carlton, if I ever want your attention, you won't come anywhere near me. But heaven forbid I try to get something done. Merri glanced at the clock, which read 7:36. Her school bell would ring promptly at 7:50. Oh, why didn't you tell me what time it was? Merri flew into her closet clad in her bird pajamas that were 2 inches too short at the ankles, and came out wearing her daily schoolwear, the jeans of which were likewise outgrown. Merri's parents would forget to refresh her wardrobe for a couple of years at a time, so most of her clothes were too small. Luckily for Merri, she did not grow terribly quickly, so she could make do. Carlton, meanwhile, settled himself into the windowsill to stare at the same blue jay Merri had, albeit with a completely different fascination. Meow, he said hungrily. Merri ran out of her bedroom with her sneakers in hand. She took the stairs 2 at a time and tripped, slamming herself into the railing and melting off the bottom steps into a jumbled heap of skinny limbs and fluffy hair. Her shoes tumbled slowly after her. She leapt up, scrambled into her shoes, ran past the breakfast table where her parents were having a rushed weekday breakfast together, but not together. Her father was half hidden behind his laptop. "Did you hear something, dear?" he asked his wife. Merri's mother, Mrs. Peasant, was too focused on the screen of her phone to respond. She was using the camera as a mirror as she checked her lipstick. "Yes, you have a good day at work too, darling." Merri threw open the pantry and ripped out the peanut butter sandwich she had made the night before for lunch, and the granola bar she had set aside for breakfast. She scrambled to stuff her things into her backpack and turned to her parents. "Mom, Dad, I have a library book due today. Could either one of you please take me by the library to return it after school?" Did you say something, dear?" her father muttered around his laptop. "Yes, breakfast is fine," her mother mumbled as she checked her email on her tablet. Merri stared at them both for a few seconds. "How about I just walk it back to the library after school, yeah?" She scrambled back upstairs to grab her library book, about birds, of course, and tumbled downstairs again, landing in a heap, this time with the book tumbling after her. She picked herself up and stuffed the book into her backpack and hurried through the kitchen. She gave her mother and father each a peck on the cheek. "See you after school." "Sure, dear," her parents simultaneously, arbitrarily replied, without looking up from their devices. Merri never bothered trying to catch the school bus in the mornings. Unremarkable as she was, the bus would often open its doors at her stop, let all the other children from her street on, then promptly close its doors before she could step up and drive nonchalantly towards its next stop. Merri usually never minded. Walking to school gave her a good opportunity to see all the neighborhood birds that would have been lost to sight on a speedy, bumpy bus ride. But this morning, as she scrambled down the street, pinwheeling her arms for better speed, she would have appreciated a lift that got her to school on time. Merri got to school exactly 4 minutes after the bell rang, but her great talent of being invisible to most people worked in her favor. Mrs. Butters did not even look up from the roll sheet she was calling from as Merri loudly tripped and flopped into her seat at the back of the room. "Sable Marsh," Mrs. Butters called as Sable snorted out a nasally, "Here." "Marcus Needle?" "Here." "Merriweather Peasant?" "Here, Miss Butters. Sorry I was late." "Merriweather Peasant." Where is that girl?" Mrs. Butters testily asked the class as she gazed around, looking right through Merri, who was waving her arms wildly. It was not until Merri lifted a corner of her desk and loudly thumped it onto the ground that her first period teacher seemed to notice her. "Oh, there you are. Do speak up during roll call, won't you?" This was the way that most of Merri's classes started. It was like she was in a constant struggle to not be counted for truancy, when in fact, Merri had never missed a day of school in her 9 years of life. Even on days when the schools were closed for winter weather, Merri had trekked across the frozen tundra of her neighborhood only to find the school windows dark, the drop-off lanes empty, and the doors locked. Her parents had seen the notices for school closures on their phones, yet neglected to tell Merri. The lunch bell rang after 2 classes. While the rest of the 4th grade students queued up for cafeteria trays, Merri found a nice tree in the courtyard to sit beneath, then pulled out her peanut butter sandwich. She had only smushed half of it in her backpack, so she counted that as a win for the day. Merri looked up into the trees, but because of how loud and garish her classmates were, there were hardly any birds at all. Merri caught a glimpse of Thomas, a boy in her science and English classes, tossing cheesy puffs to a scraggly-looking grackle beside the table. Merri was craning her neck to see the grackle better when a shadow fell over her. The half of sandwich she hadn't eaten yet was knocked out of her hand and stomped on. "Oh, hey, Cecilia," Merri grumbled without taking her eyes off the grackle. "Who said you could talk to me, nerd?" asked the tall blonde girl, who would have been quite pretty if not for the permanent scowl on her face. "I see you staring at Thomas, but don't get your hopes up, bird brain. He's totally one of my biggest fans, so don't even bother." Merri picked up her dirty sandwich chunk, stood, dusted the crumbs off her lap, and tossed it into the air. The grackle Thomas had been trying to feed cocked its head on seeing the sandwich, then immediately took flight in a burst of molting feathers. Cecilia gaped in horror as the sandwich landed on her head. "How dare you, you little outcast! I had just gotten my bangs to—" "Ah!" Cecilia squawked as the grackle landed on her head as well and began berating her with its wings to get the sticky sandwich free of her hair. Merri slipped off, grinning, as Cecilia flailed her arms in frustration and panic, then ran for the building doors as the happy grackle pecked at the bread it had extracted from Cecilia's hair. Merri reached her next class, science, a little early. 3rd period science was the only class that she ever looked forward to. "Good afternoon, Miss Penny," Merri huffed, slightly out of breath from speed walking away from the lunch scene. Miss Penny was a 30-something woman with graying black hair and olive skin. She always wore large framed glasses and an expression of intense worry when she thought no one could see. She looked up from the leftovers she was eating at her desk as she graded papers. "Oh, good afternoon, Merri. Is lunch already over? I must have missed the bell. I wouldn't doubt it." Merri liked Miss Penny for the warm smile she gave her students, and because she was the only teacher, the only adult, really, that seemed to notice Merriweather without an abundance of noise and commotion on Merri's part. "Oh, no, Miss Penny. I just, finished my sandwich early." Her stomach growled loudly, and for quite a long time. As it turned out, while the grackle appreciated the dirty half sandwich, Merri's own stomach was missing it greatly. Miss Penny's face broke into a wide grin. "It seems like you finished earlier than you should have. Here." She tossed Merri an apple from her lunch sack, and Merri awkwardly knocked her chair and bag over trying to catch the apple, which hit her squarely between the eyes. "Thank you," she told Miss Penny, absently rubbing her face as she bit into the apple. Miss Penny peered at the library book that had spilled out of Merri's bag. "Ah, are you interested in birds, Merri?" "I've always found them to be rats with wings, but then I've also been pretty fond of rodents, so I suppose I would like them if I gave them half the chance." Merri eagerly stumbled out of her desk, sprawling out along the aisle between the desks on her way to Miss Penny's desk. "Oh my goodness, yes. Birds are the most interesting thing that I have ever read about, and I spend a lot of time reading." She clumsily banged her hip against Miss Penny's desk and stumbled to point out the window. "See that flock flying up there? Those are grackles. See how the sun shines on their black feathers and makes them turn different colors? Fascinating. And look, just there." Merri pointed her apple core and spat bits of chewed apple as she excitedly pointed to a tree sapling the school had purchased, sitting in a wheelbarrow just outside Miss Penny's window. The roots at the bottom of the tree were still bagged, but it had been sitting there for days, so the local wildlife had already started claiming it. "That is the nest of an endangered bird, the fluff-faced egret owl." Miss Penny sat as still as a statue watching Merri. She had never seen this quiet young girl so animated, nor had she ever heard her say so many words. She grinned over her lasagna at her student. I don't believe I've ever even noticed the tree out there, let alone the nest in it. Thank you for pointing it out. The bell rang, and Merri bumped into 3 desks and a chair as she happily walked back to her seat and put her knocked-over effects back in order. The rest of the day passed as usual, but Merri could have sworn she saw Thomas smiling at her as she was staring past him through the window. After the last bell rang for the day, Merri hugged the wall as she fought the crowds to get out the doors. Large groups of people were always extra difficult when you were as invisible as Merryweather. Once she got outside, she stopped by a tree to pull out her library book so she would remember to drop it off on the way home. Well, not really on the way home. It was out of the way home, but no one had offered to drive her, so that was just her new roundabout way home. She quietly walked along the sidewalk, only tripping on every third crack in the pavement or so. "Hey, wait!" She heard a voice shout behind her as she headed down the big concrete steps at the edge of the school grounds. Merri moved onto the grass to let whoever it was pass by her. They sounded like they were in a rush, after all. "Wait, stop!" Merri felt a tap on her shoulder and whirled around so swiftly and so startled that she raised her book in defense and accidentally whacked Thomas right in the nose. "Ouch," Thomas said, clapping a hand over his nose that was now as red as his hair. "Sorry, Thomas's nose," said Merryweather. She was not used to talking to anyone her own age other than Cecilia, and so was finding it difficult to start an actual conversation. "Oh, that's all right, I guess." Thomas shook his head and rubbed his nose. "I just wanted to ask how you knew what that crow would eat. I've been trying to share my lunch with it for days." Merri blinked at Thomas. "Oh, that was a grackle at the courtyard. I spend a lot of time watching, feeding, and thinking about birds is all. So I know what they go for, especially the local ones that I've fed before. Today it was peanut butter with a side of Cecilia." Thomas stared at her for a moment and then laughed. "Yeah, I think she really got freaked out. At least it stopped her from bugging you. Sorry she threw your sandwich on the ground. That was a rotten thing to do." He fidgeted awkwardly and rubbed at a cowlick that always seemed to be sticking out of the back of his head. Yeah, it's just, Cecilia." Merri awkwardly shifted from foot to foot, hugging her book. The teachers would stop it, but they never seemed to notice. They continued awkwardly staring at each other until a shout rang out behind Merri. "Hey, loser! Looks like there's no stupid birds to help you now." "Oh, good. I was hoping Cecilia would follow me after school." Merri braced as Cecilia's footsteps got closer. Merri saw that Cecilia's usually perfect hair was in disarray, and she had 2 pink bandages, one on her forehead and one on her cheek. The grackle, apparently, had a little trouble getting all that sandwich off her head. "Hey, Thomas, stay away from this weirdo. You don't want some kind of bird freak liking you." "And she does. Merri likes you." Cecilia shoved Merri in the shoulder, pushing her and making her stumble backwards into a mud puddle. "Well, I don't hate him." "And she wants to marry you, Thomas." "That's actually inaccurate. I've never given it any thought." "And have 50 babies." "Well, that's just completely unrealistic. I'm not even sure that's humanly possible." Merri watched as Cecilia sidled up to Thomas and held onto his arm, looking up at him and batting her eyelashes. Thomas was looking down at like his arm had sprouted a new and disgusting sort of mushroom. "Get out of here, you little nerd. Nobody wants to hang out with a freak like you anyway. Everybody knows you don't have any friends." Cecilia sneered through her teeth at Merri while Thomas continued to stare at the girl attached to his arm like she was made out of spiders. Cecilia reached out and pushed her shoulder again, making Merri drop her library book in the mud. She hastily tried to wipe the mud splatters off the cover and held it close. Merri turned bright red and her eyes filled with tears. "Oh yeah? Well, I don't like him. I just thought it was nice that he knows what birds are." Just as confused as they were, Merryweather sprinted away down the sidewalk. She dropped the library book she had been clutching when she bumped into 2 bushes, but made it around the corner and out of sight before the tears spilled out. Chapter 3. Merri Sees Really Weird Squirrels. Merryweather ran until she reached the park near the library. The park was always deserted. The play equipment was run down, and the trees were overgrown. It was a perfect place to sit on a bench or climb a tree and have a good cry while she watched the birds. She was devastated to see half a dozen tractors, excavators, backhoes, and all manner of destruction all over the perimeter. Her eyes were blurry with angry tears as she ran headfirst into a man wearing an orange vest and a hard hat. "Whoa there, little miss. What's the matter, huh? You all right?" He stuttered her by the shoulders as she wobbled in place and fought to keep a straight face, fooling no one on account of all the other tears already staining her face and the top of her shirt. "No, sir, I am perfectly all right now. What are you doing here, sir, if I can ask you that, sir?" Merri spoke robotically, straining to keep from crying anymore. Her eyes were uncomfortably open to keep the tears from spilling out. She very much resembled a fish, unblinking and potentially lidless. "Well, now, I suppose you're not going to like this much, little miss." The big man pushed back his helmet and rubbed his forehead where the straps had dug in. "I'm the foreman of this group, but please don't hold that against me." He fidgeted uncomfortably as Merri stared at him with eyes like an owl. Well, you see, we got a contract to, The loud beeps of the backhoe cut him off as a tree was shoved over on the other side of the park that had been roped off. Merri started bawling outright and loudly shouted in the foreman's general direction. "This is the worst day ever. My parents noticed me even less than usual. I tripped about 40 times. Thomas likes Cecilia. I lost half a sandwich. Cecilia is a monster. My library book fell in the mud and I think I lost it. And now you're tearing down the last park in the whole city?" Well, yes, the last part is right. I can't really say yes or no about the first bits." The foreman looked relieved that she had said it out loud and not him. "There's an inspector coming by later this evening to approve the progress. They want to put up a fancy car wash, I believe." Merri looked horrified, and her face contorted into a variety of expressions, each one more upset than the last. "A car wash? Who in the world needs a car wash more than a slice of natural bliss?" She began to hyperventilate and started scrambling up the nearest big tree. Once she was onto the first big branch and looked fairly safe enough, the foreman trudged back to his group. He held his helmet in his hands in a sad and defeated sort of march towards the roped-off section at the other end of the park. Merri went as high as she dared and nestled into a nook near the middle of the big tree that she'd sat in dozens of times before when she was feeling particularly invisible. Sometimes the birds even came back to their nests when she was right next to them. Right now, though, only the endangered owls she had pointed out to Miss Penny were nesting, and she was alone. She reached over to her backpack to see if there was anything tucked away somewhere that she could have as a snack, but she promptly dropped it all the way to the ground. "Well, phoo," she said, and immediately resumed crying. Merri was in the middle of an especially big wail as she watched the construction crew plodding along in their progress, chainsawing branches and digging up tree stumps when something brushed against her cheek. She swatted at her shoulder as a bushy-tailed gray squirrel hopped off it, chirping and barking at her, bushy tail swishing violently. She heard squirrel chatter coming from above and below and behind and in front of her. Squirrels were everywhere, and they seemed to all be staring straight at Merri. "Go away, squirrels," Merri angrily sniffled. "Can't you see I'm trying to be devastated right now?" She swatted half-heartedly at the furry little rodents as they chattered and seemed to point at her. "Oh, what's the matter, freak? Even your rat friends don't like you anymore?" A rude voice carried from the base of the tree. "Oh, great," muttered Merri as she snapped a branch she was leaning on and tumbled down through the many branches and landed in a heap in front of Cecilia, who was tauntingly holding Merri's backpack by one strap, with her other hand on her hip. "They're actually squirrels, Cecilia." "Look at you, just playing around with all the other rodents. Pfft, that's what you are. You're like a little mouse. Mousy weather peasant." Ha ha. Cecilia looked wickedly pleased with herself and started chanting. "Mousy weather peasant, mousy weather peasant." Merri grabbed at her backpack, but Cecilia was taller and she kept pulling it just out of reach. "Why do you hate me, Cecilia?" Merri sighed out, resigned to being picked on by the one other kid that seemed to notice her. Cecilia looked confused for a second, turned beet red, and then went back to snarling at Merri. "Because you're annoying, obviously." She was gearing up to throw Merri's backpack into one of the big muddy pits left by the excavators, but she stopped as something hit her from the tree. She rubbed her head where a large acorn had thumped into it and looked up. More acorns began pelting her from above, and Cecilia shrieked and swatted at them as half a dozen squirrels dropped down and began to scurry all over her. Merri watched in awe as Cecilia screamed bloody murder, but as far as Merri could tell, the squirrels were just running all around her, not hurting her. The biggest squirrel sat right on top of her head, clutching onto her now tangled blonde hair like reins as she flailed her arms and tried to shake off the squirrels. The big squirrel sat upright, still holding on with his little back toes, and there was a bright burst of green light and a puff of what appeared to be glitter, and Cecilia stopped moving altogether. She was in a very uncomfortable-looking pose, with one foot balanced in the air and both of her hands reaching behind her to grab at the squirrels on her back. She slowly started turning the gray of marble from the top of her head all the way to the one foot she had left planted on the ground. The squirrels were all perched on Cecilia, who was, in fact, a marble statue now. Merri said, "Weird," and promptly fainted. Chapter 4. Merri Takes a Fall. Merri woke to the horrible stench of fresh skunk spray. It smelled so terrible that she could taste it. It was not a pleasant taste or smell. She was lying on her back and staring straight up at the sky through the branches of a tree. One of those branches looked suspiciously like a stone arm, maybe about the size of a fourth grader's arm. She tilted her head slightly to the side and saw the rest of the Cecilia statue. Well, I guess it wasn't a dream then. No, human peasant, it was not, shouted a small voice to her left. Merri propped herself up on her elbows and turned to look at the half a dozen squirrels all lined up and staring at her intently. Merri blinked at them. Oh, man, I must have hit my head pretty hard when I went down. It sounded like that squirrel just said something. Ha ha, talking squirrels, that would be... Each squirrel knelt, and 6 fairies popped into existence, hurriedly pressing some sort of brooches and hopping down from the squirrels' backs. One of them bowed slightly in front of Merri. Don't be silly. Squirrels don't speak human speak. But we do. The fairy smiled warmly at Merri. Another, angrier-looking fairy took a few steps towards Merri, who was still laying half propped up on her elbows, and stared at her intently. Are you guys sure that this is the human we've been waiting for? She looks awfully young. The first fairy trotted up to the angrier one. Of course she is, Thistle. You heard what the other one called her. She's a peasant. And here I thought humans didn't even have peasants anymore. She peered into Merri's face. She does look young, but she also looks kind, and the squirrels seem to like her. Thistle, the grumpy fairy, glared directly into one of Merri's eyes, presumably looking for prophetic heroics. Well, she doesn't look like the hero we need, does she, Acorn? Acorn, the kinder fairy, hustled Thistle out of the way as Merri sat up and crossed her legs, peering down at them. Oh, don't mind him. Thistle is just a little skeptical is all. You match the prophecy perfectly. Well, almost perfectly. Well, I mean, it just refers to a friendless peasant. Do you have many friends, human? Merri awkwardly cleared her throat. None, actually. Unless you count my cat. Do you count my cat? Thistle glared with his arms crossed. No, we do not. But you are a peasant, aren't you? We heard the larger girl calling you one. Well, yes, sort of. It's my name, if that counts. My name is Merriweather Annabelle Peasant, but I guess I'm more of a middle-class American sort, not really a peasant per se. Merri fumbled over her words, trying to assess her own status for the first time in her whole 9 years. That settles it! Acorn clapped her tiny hands and rustled her glittery wings. You're the one who's going to save our trees! The rest of the fairies, except for Thistle, gave a rousing and hearty cheer at this. Merri began to feel overwhelmed and wobbled as she sat, feeling lightheaded and like she very well might do the whole fainting routine again, when Thistle pouted in her direction. Looks like this peasant is going to take a nap on us again. I think we'd better just show her instead of trying to explain. Acorn clapped again. Oh, good idea, Thistle. She waved her hands in an intricate way, and with a puff of glitter, the dirt under Merri began to slant, then open up into what looked like the mouth of a slide into the dark underground, with roots sticking out from the sides of the tunnel. Merri had time for exactly one "Ah!" before slipping into the slide and falling into the darkness with the fairies and squirrels flitting happily after her. As the ground closed back up, the Cecilia statue wobbled on its one foot, then steadied. A bird landed on top of her stone head, and another landed on her shoulder.